They only noticed him when something went wrong. The floor stretched in endless glass panels beneath the vaulted ceiling, glowing faint violet under the palace lights, each step echoing like a measured heartbeat. And at the far edge of that perfection, a man in a faded gray uniform pushed a quiet cleaning unit across the surface, his boots soft, his presence softer, as if the palace itself had decided he didn't matter. Marcus Cole kept his eyes down, not out of fear, but out of habit, the kind built over years of being unseen, unheard, and unasked. The air smelled faintly of ionized metal and sterilized air, the kind that never quite felt alive, and above him, banners shimmered with shifting alien script, histories of power written in light, none of them mentioning people like him. His gloves were worn at the fingertips, patched more than once, and when he moved carefully, deliberately, as if every inch of space deserved respect, even if no one offered him the same. A soft chime echoed across the hall, signaling the return of the queen, and instantly the atmosphere shifted, guards straightening, officials aligning, voices lowering into reverent silence. Marcus didn't look up. He adjusted the cleaning nozzle by half an inch, watching the reflection of the ceiling ripple across the polished floor, the only way he ever saw the world above him. Boots approached, precise, synchronized, the rhythm of authority, and then another set followed, lighter, slower, carrying something heavier than rank. The reflection came first. Blue. Not just blue, but luminous, like deep water catching sunlight. He paused, just for a second, the nozzle hovering over a faint streak that didn't quite belong. Around him, the court held its breath, waiting for perfection, expecting obedience, and somewhere behind that silence, a faint irregularity broke through, a stagger in the queen's step, so subtle most would miss it. Marcus didn't. He tilted the nozzle away from her path, just slightly, adjusting the trajectory so she wouldn't step on the still damp surface. No announcement, no permission, just a small correction. Careful, he said quietly, not looking up, his voice steady. Almost absent, like it had no right to exist in a place like this. It's still wet. The words barely traveled 3 feet, but they landed like a shockwave. A guard shifted. Someone inhaled sharply. Protocol cracked, just a hairline fracture, but enough. Marcus resumed his motion, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just spoken directly into the gravity of power. But the footsteps stopped. The reflection didn't move. Blue light held still on the glass floor, trembling just slightly, as if caught between memory and reality. Marcus felt it before he saw it. The change in the air, the kind that didn't belong to rank or command, but to something older, something human. He didn't look up. Not yet. Because something told him, if he did, everything would change. The silence stretched longer than it should have, not the respectful kind, but the uncertain kind, the kind that made trained soldiers forget where to place their hands and seasoned officials hesitate before breathing. And still Marcus did not look up, because silence like that usually meant trouble, and trouble for someone like him did not come with warnings, it came with consequences, yet nothing came, no command, no correction, no sharp voice reminding him of his place, only the faint sound of fabric shifting and a breath that did not belong to authority, but to something far more fragile. And then, against every expectation written into the walls of that palace, the queen spoke, her voice softer than the hum of the lighting grid. You moved it before I stepped. And it was not an accusation, it was not even a question, it was something else entirely, something searching. Marcus kept his hands steady on the cleaning unit, guiding it along the glass with precise, practiced motions. Yes, ma'am, he said simply, still not looking at her, because looking directly at power was a privilege he had long ago learned not to take. Another pause followed, heavier now, filled with something that pressed against the air itself, and somewhere behind her, a guard shifted weight, metal lightly brushing against metal, a quiet reminder that this moment was not normal, not allowed, not understood. Why? She asked, and the word echoed differently, not sharp, not commanding, but almost confused. Marcus exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried no fear, only truth worn down to its simplest form. Because the floor was wet. He replied, as if that answered everything, as if that was enough, and for him, it was a small, Practical truth in a world that made everything too complicated. The court did not move, did not speak. But the tension grew, invisible lines tightening between rank and reality. Expectation and something else that did not follow rules. And then, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable. The queen took a step forward, not away, not around him, but toward him, closer than protocol allowed. Close enough that her reflection no longer stretched across the floor, but stood directly beside his. Blue light and gray uniform side by side in the polished glass. And Marcus felt it then, the change in proximity. The kind that made every instinct tell him to step back, to create distance, to restore order. But he did not move, because something about the way she stood there did not feel like power closing in. It felt like something lost trying to find its way back. "Look at me," she said, and this time it was not a command. It was quieter than that, almost careful, and that was what made it impossible to ignore. Marcus hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then slowly lifted his gaze. Not fully, just enough to meet her reflection first, and in that reflection, he saw it. Not the crown, not the status, but the eyes, bright and searching and familiar. A flicker of something passed through him, quick and sharp, like a memory trying to surface through fog, but it slipped away before he could catch it. And when his eyes finally met hers directly, the world around them seemed to hold itself in place, waiting for something neither of them had words for yet. For a fraction of a second, Marcus forgot where he was, not because the palace disappeared, but because something in her eyes did not belong to this place, not to power, not to command, but to a memory that refused to stay buried, and it unsettled him more than any guard ever could. He straightened slightly, just enough to regain distance without stepping back, his voice calm, measured. "Is there something you need, ma'am?" Formal, neutral, safe, the kind of words that built walls where none existed before. But she did not answer right away. Her gaze did not shift, did not soften. It searched, as if comparing him to something only she could see. And around them, the court began to fracture in silence. A senior advisor leaned toward another, whispering behind a raised hand. A guard adjusted his stance, uncertain whether to intervene or remain still. Protocol had no script for this, and that alone made it dangerous. "You," she began, then stopped, as if the word itself was not enough. Her hand lifted slightly, not to command, not to dismiss, but to reach, and she caught herself midway, fingers tightening before lowering again, restraint replacing instinct. Marcus noticed. Of course he did. He noticed everything. The way her breathing was just a fraction uneven, the way her shoulders held. Tension that had nothing to do with posture. And something in him responded before he could stop it. Not as a janitor, but as something older, something trained to read people when words failed. "You should sit," he said quietly, the words slipping out before he weighed them. Simple, direct, and completely out of place. A murmur rippled through the hall, not loud, but sharp. Disbelief carried on controlled breaths. No one told the queen to sit. No one suggested comfort to someone who defined it. For others, but Marcus had already reached for a nearby console, adjusting the environmental controls by a few degrees, lowering the ambient brightness just slightly. Small changes, almost invisible, but intentional. "The light is too harsh," he added, as if explaining himself, as if that made it acceptable. The queen blinked, once, slow, deliberate, and for the first time, something in her expression shifted. Not authority, not confusion, but recognition, faint, incomplete. "But there, you." "Always," she whispered, more to herself than to him, and the words faded before they could form into meaning. Marcus paused, his hand resting on the console, a faint hum responding beneath his palm, and again. That flicker came, that almost memory, like a voice heard through walls, too distant to understand, too close to ignore. "Have we met before?" she asked, and this time the question carried weight, not curiosity, but need, the kind that did not belong in a throne room. Marcus shook his head slowly, not dismissive, not defensive, just certain in the way a man becomes when his life has been defined by places like this. "No, ma'am," he said, steady, grounded, and for a moment, that seemed to be the end of it, the answer settling into the space between them, accepted by everyone except her, because her gaze did not release him, did not let the answer stand, and somewhere deep behind her eyes, something refused to agree. The answer should have settled it, clean and final, but instead it lingered, hanging in the air like a note that refused to fade, and the queen's gaze did not waver, not even for a breath, as if the word no meant less to her than the silence that followed it. And that was when the shift became undeniable, not loud, not dramatic, but deep, something beneath protocol beginning to fracture. "You are wrong," she said softly, not accusing, not angry, just certain in a way that made the room feel smaller. And Marcus felt it then, the weight of attention turning fully toward him, not as a servant, but as a question that needed answering. A senior official stepped forward, careful, measured. "Your Majesty, this human has no record of prior contact with the crown." His voice smooth, practiced, the kind that existed to restore order, to pull moments like this back into lines that made sense. But she did not look at him, did not acknowledge the interruption. Her focus remained on Marcus, unwavering. And something in that refusal made the official hesitate, made the guards hold their positions instead of closing in, because even power waits when it does not understand what it is seeing. Marcus lowered his hand from the console slowly, the faint hum fading behind him, and for the first time, he felt something he had not allowed himself in years: uncertainty, not fear, not panic. Just a quiet recognition that the past he had buried might not be as far away as he believed. "Ma'am," he said again, steady, controlled, but there was a fraction of something beneath it now, something less certain, and she heard it. Of course she did. Her head tilted just slightly, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but filled with intent, like she was listening for something beyond his words. "When I was small," she began, her voice lowering, not for secrecy, but for memory. "There was a place that smelled like metal and dust, and the sky was not blue. It was gray. Always gray." The court stilled further, if that was even possible, because this was not how a queen spoke, not in public, not in front of those who measured her in titles and decisions. But she continued, because whatever this was had already stepped beyond those boundaries. "I do not remember everything," she said. "Only pieces, fragments, a voice that told me to stay close, to keep moving, to not look back." Marcus's breath slowed, just slightly, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm he forced to remain even. But his mind shifted, just a fraction, as if something long dormant had turned toward the sound of its own name. "And there was someone," she said, and this time her voice almost broke, not in weakness, but in the strain of holding something too important to lose. "Someone who carried me when I could not walk, who covered my eyes when the light was too bright, who said—" She stopped, her expression tightening, searching for a word that refused to come, and Marcus felt it then, not as a memory, but as a sensation, a weight in his arms that did not exist anymore, a small shape pressed against him, a voice he had not heard in years echoing faintly through time, and for the first time, he did not answer immediately, he did not correct, did not deny. He simply stood there, caught between who he was now and something he had tried very hard to forget. And the silence that followed was no longer empty, it was waiting. The word would not come, and that was what made it real, not the memory itself, but the way it resisted being spoken, like it belonged to a time before language, before titles, before she was anything more than something small and lost. And Marcus felt his hand tighten slightly at his side, not from tension, but from recognition he had not yet accepted. The court remained frozen, watching something they could not measure, because this was no longer about rank or protocol. This was about something older than both. "What did he say?" Marcus asked quietly, and the question surprised even him, because it was not denial, it was not correction, it was invitation, a step towards something he had spent years avoiding. The queen's eyes sharpened, not in authority, but in focus, as if the question had aligned something inside her. "He said." She closed her eyes for a moment, not in weakness, but in effort, reaching past years of distance, past layers of memory that had been buried beneath responsibility and survival. "He said I would be all right." Her voice softened, barely more than breath. Even when nothing around us was, the words settled between them, simple, unadorned, and Marcus exhaled slowly, because that was not something taught, not something learned in a palace or a court. That was something said in places where comfort had to be created out of nothing, and the flicker in his mind sharpened, no longer distant, no longer abstract, but close, too close. A corridor dimly lit, the smell of worn metal and stale air, a small figure clinging to him, trembling, and his own voice, quieter then, but steady, saying words he had not thought about in years. "You will be all right." He had said it more than once, not because he believed it, but because she needed him to, and his hand shifted slightly now, as if remembering the weight it used to carry, and the court saw it, not the memory, but the change, the smallest break in the stillness of a man who had until now been nothing but steady, and that was enough to unsettle them further. There are many who could have said that. An official interjected, voice carefully controlled, trying to reclaim the moment, to reduce it to coincidence, to logic, because logic was safe. And this was not. Marcus did not look at him, did not respond, because the moment was no longer his to control. It belonged to something else now, something unfolding whether they understood it or not. The queen stepped closer, just a single step, but it erased the last of the distance between them, her presence no longer framed by the hall, but by him, by the man she could not place and yet could not ignore. "He called me something," she said, her voice steady again, but softer now, more certain. "Not a title, not a name given by my people." Her eyes held his, searching, not demanding, but asking in the only way she could. "He called me." She hesitated again, but this time it was different, not because the memory was missing, but because saying it would change everything, and Marcus felt it, the edge of something irreversible, the point where silence could no longer protect what had been hidden, and for the first time since she had spoken, he did not want her to finish, because he already knew what was coming, and he was not sure he was ready to hear it. The silence tightened like a held breath that no one dared release, and Marcus felt it settle into his chest, heavy and familiar, like the moment before something breaks, not with noise, but with truth, and he knew, even before she spoke, that whatever she was about to say would not belong to this room. It would belong to something far older than crowns and titles, something neither of them could put back once it was named. The queen's lips parted slowly, her voice steady now, no longer searching, no longer uncertain. "He called me, kid." The word landed softly, almost too small for the space it entered, but its weight was undeniable. It did not echo like commands or declarations. It sank deep into the foundation of everything around them, and Marcus closed his eyes for just a fraction of a second, not long enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for the past to reach him completely. No longer fragments, no longer distant impressions, but whole, clear, undeniable, a narrow corridor under failing lights, the faint hum of systems struggling to stay alive. A small figure with blue skin pressed against his chest, too quiet, too still, and his own voice, rough from exhaustion, but steady in the only way that mattered. "Hey, kid, stay with me." He had said it without thinking, not as a title, not as a role, just as something human, something immediate, and now, standing in a palace that had no place for that word, he felt it return to him like it had never left. He opened his eyes again, slowly, and this time he did not look at her as a queen. He looked at her as someone he might have known once, someone he might have carried, and the distance between them, it changed, not in space, but in meaning. The court reacted. Of course they did. Whispers broke free, controlled but urgent, a ripple of disbelief that moved through ranks and positions, because this did not fit. It did not align with anything they understood. A janitor, a human, connected to the queen by something as simple, as impossible, as a single word. "This is coincidence," someone said, not loudly, but firmly, trying to anchor the moment back into reason. "Many humans use such informal terms," another added, grasping for explanation, because explanation was safer than what this felt like. Marcus did not respond, not to them, not yet, because the moment was not theirs to control. It never had been. The queen took another step forward, and this time there was no hesitation, no restraint, only certainty, and in that certainty, the last barrier between them disappeared. "You said it when I could not speak," she continued, her voice stronger now, grounded in something she could finally hold on to. "You said it when I could not see, when everything was too loud, too bright. Her eyes did not leave his, and there was no authority in them now. Only recognition, only something that had waited too long to be named. Marcus felt his breath slow, not forced, not controlled, just natural, as if something inside him had finally stopped resisting. And he understood then, not fully, not completely, but enough to know that the past he had buried had not been lost. It had been carried, just not by him alone. And the room, the court, the palace, it all faded slightly at the edges, not disappearing, but losing importance, because what stood between them now was something that did not need witnesses to be real, and yet everyone was watching. The words settled between them like something fragile, that had somehow survived years of distance, and Marcus felt his shoulders lower just slightly, not in surrender, but in recognition, the kind that did not need confirmation to be real. And for the first time since this began, he did not try to step back into the role the palace had given him. He simply stood there, present, the man he had always been beneath the uniform. "Yeah," he said quietly. The word rough at the edges, unfamiliar in this place but honest. "I used to say that," and it was. Not a declaration, not a claim, just a simple truth placed into the space between them. And the queen inhaled sharply, not out of shock, but out of relief, like something inside her had finally aligned, something that had been searching for years had just found its answer. And she took another step closer, close enough now that the distance between them was no longer defined by rank or space, but by memory. "You carried me," she said. And this time it was not a question, it was a statement. Steady, grounded, undeniable. "When I could not walk." Marcus did not respond immediately, his gaze steady on hers, because the memory was there now, not as a blur, not as something he could dismiss, but as something complete, the weight of a small body, the quiet trust of someone who had no other choice, the way she had held on to him without asking permission, and the way he had not let go, not until he knew she would be safe. "For a while," he said finally, his voice calm, almost distant, not because he did not care, but because he did not know how to place that moment into the present, into this. And the court reacted again, more sharply now, voices rising just enough to break the illusion of control. "This is impossible," one of the advisors said, stepping forward despite himself. "There are no records of such an incident, no documentation, no." "Enough," the queen said, and the word did not need to be loud to carry authority. The room stilled instantly, because this was something they understood: power, command, control. But what followed was not what they expected, because she did not turn back to her throne, did not re-establish distance. Instead, she lowered herself, slowly, deliberately, until she was no longer standing above him, but level, her gaze unwavering, her posture no longer that of a ruler, but of someone choosing something else entirely, something far more personal. Marcus felt it before anyone else understood it. The shift, the breaking of something unspoken, and for the first time, he hesitated, not because he feared it, but because he knew what it meant. Once this line was crossed, there would be no returning to the quiet anonymity he had lived in, no stepping back into being unseen. And yet, he did not move, because part of him had already stepped forward long ago, in a place far from here, when he chose to carry someone who needed him. And the queen lowered further, her movement slow, intentional, until the space between them was no longer defined by height, by rank, by anything the court understood, and the entire hall held its breath, not out of respect, but because something irreversible was happening, something none of them could stop. And Marcus realized then, this was not about the past anymore. This was about what it meant now. The moment stretched to its breaking point, and then quietly, without ceremony, it crossed it. The queen lowered herself fully, her knees touching the polished glass floor that moments ago had reflected only power and distance, and now reflected something else entirely, something the court had no language for. Her head bowed just slightly, not in weakness, not in submission, but in recognition, in choice. And the sound that followed was not a gasp, not a shout, but the absence of breath. An entire hall forgetting how to inhale. Marcus did not move, not because he was frozen, but because he understood, in a way the others could not, that this was not about him. Not really. This was about what she had carried all these years, something small and human that had survived everything else. "You told me I would be all right," she said softly, her voice steady now, anchored in memory instead of searching for it. And I believed you. The words settled into the space between them, simple, unadorned, but heavier than any title she had ever spoken. Marcus looked down at her, not as a ruler, not as a figure of authority, but as someone he once held, and something in his chest shifted, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a quiet alignment of past and present. Looks like you were, he said, just as quietly, and there was no pride in it, no claim, just acknowledgement. And that was what broke the room, because it was too normal, too human, too far removed from the hierarchy they lived by. Whispers turned into movement, subtle at first, then spreading, officials exchanging looks they could not hide, guards tightening their formation without stepping forward, because even they did not know what action this moment required. And at the edge of the hall, someone lowered their gaze, then another, not in obedience, but in something closer to understanding, because what stood before them was not defiance, it was truth, and truth did not follow protocol. The queen lifted her head slightly, her eyes meeting his again, no longer searching, no longer uncertain, but steady, complete. You left before I could say it, she said, and there was no accusation in it, only fact, only the weight of time that had passed without closure. Marcus exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible. You were safe, he replied, as if that explained everything, as if that had been enough. And for him, it had been. He had never stayed to be thanked, never waited to be remembered. He had done what needed to be done, and then he had moved on, because that was who he was. But now, he saw what that moment had become, not just for him, but for her, and the court watched, not interrupting, not correcting, because something had shifted beyond their reach, something they could only witness, not control, and the queen's voice softened once more, quieter than before, but clearer than anything she had said since entering the hall. Father, she said, and this time there was no hesitation, no doubt, just truth spoken aloud. And Marcus did not correct her, did not deny it. He simply stood there, letting the word exist, letting it settle, letting it change everything it touched, and in that silence that followed, the palace itself seemed to listen. No one gave the order, and yet it happened, one by one. Almost imperceptibly at first, the members of the court lowered their heads, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but because something in the air demanded it, something quieter than authority and stronger than command. And Marcus stood there in the center of it all, a man in a worn gray uniform, hands still marked by work no one had ever noticed, and for the first time, he was no longer invisible. But he did not straighten, did not step forward, did not claim anything that had just been placed at his feet, because that was never who he had been. The queen remained where she was for a moment longer, not as a ruler, not as a symbol, but as someone who had finally reached the end of a long, silent search. And when she rose, it was not to reclaim power, but to carry something else with her, something that did not need a throne to exist. Her gaze stayed on him, steady, calm, no longer searching, because she had already found what she came for. You disappeared, she said softly, not as a complaint, but as a truth she had carried. And Marcus gave a small nod, the kind that held no apology, only understanding. That was the job, he replied, simple, direct, as it had always been. And she studied him for a second longer, as if weighing that answer against everything she had become, then gave the smallest nod in return, accepting it, not because it explained everything, but because it was enough. Around them, the court began to shift again, but differently. Now, more careful, more aware, as if they had just witnessed something they did not fully understand but would never forget. A guard near the entrance straightened, then lowered his gaze again, slower this time, deliberate, and others followed, not in unison, but in quiet agreement. The world they knew had not shattered, but it had changed, just slightly, just enough. Marcus reached for the cleaning unit again, his hand steady, familiar, and resumed his motion across the glass floor, the soft hum returning as if nothing had happened, as if everything had not just changed. And that was the part that held the most weight, not the kneeling, not the word, but the way he returned to what he was doing, unchanged in the way that mattered most. The queen watched him for a moment, something unreadable in her expression, then turned, not away from him, but forward, carrying the moment with her into whatever came next. And as she moved, the light caught her eyes, reflecting across the polished floor where his work had left it clear, and for just a second, their reflections aligned again, blue and gray, side by side. Not equal in rank, not equal in power, but connected by something that had never needed either. And the palace, vast and silent, held that image without a word, because some things did not need to be spoken to be understood. And as Marcus guided the cleaning unit forward, his voice barely above a whisper, almost lost in the hum, he said, "You made it. Not to the court, not to the guards, but to her, and maybe, just maybe, to the memory they both carried." And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of meaning, the kind that stayed long after the moment had passed.